Okay, let's look at part 2 of this particular week, and which is again on expansion. And there are a number of reasons why the Romans moved into different areas, and I will say it's sort of a hot research topic on whether the Romans sort of accidentally took over a large chunk of land, at least in the 300s, or if it was done on purpose. And sometimes it's pretty clear that it was done on purpose. Other times it's not so clear, which brings up the whole scholarly debate on this. There is sort of a population pressure issue that's happening in Roman-held territories where you've got up to 150,000 people living within that area. And remember, I said it was about 1,000 acres. You've got about 750,000 free Romans. That's not including the slave population. So this is a lot of population, a lot of people to feed, a lot of people that need a place to live. And this could be some of the reasons why the Romans did what they did in terms of, and there's a couple of things to think about in terms of what happens with this growth. Two questions here, how do these changes affect the patrician class? So you really want to think about what was happening during this period. And we talked about this in the last lecture about how the patricians are grabbing up all of this new territory. And then you've got these new laws that sort of try and restrict how much territory these people have. But I mean, if you really get down to the nitty-gritty, how did it affect these people, the patricians? Well, they certainly became much more wealthy. Simple answer. If you think about the farmers, there's sort of two things that are happening with the farmers. One is, of course, there's more land for them. So more land technically should mean more money for them. But as we talked about in the last lecture, if you get a bad crop or bad season, then what that does is it brings more debt to these farmers. So could be a benefit, could be something really bad for them. Another thing to ask yourself is, how did this growth happen? Partly it's because of the way that the military was set up. So what I've done here is broken down what is called a legion. This was a group of 5,000 men that the Romans had decided was the best way to put their military together. And when you think about who are these people, who make up these 5,000, you've got, of course, native Romans. They are almost always in charge of their military. You've got allies like the Latin League and all these other places where they've gone in and taken control and then set up these situations where those living on the land owe their loyalty to the Romans, and the Romans will protect them. And of course, these allies are coming from the population that have to be given up to go to war. And mercenaries are people who are paid to fight. This becomes much more popular in the Roman period a little bit later. Excuse me. And then you've got centurions who were the leaders of these legions. Then you need to think about what's happening in these areas where the Romans are coming in and taking over. Maybe we should look at number 3 first, because we've talked about this. Usually the Romans will look at these territories and they'll come in and pretty much hold a big stick over people. And normally what would happen is these people just say, okay, it's probably better to be under Roman control than, someone else. So then you get these agreements that we just talked about. Romans will protect them, they will protect the Romans, you give up people for the military. What you also start to see is the Romans giving citizenship to some of these people. Now we'll talk about this in just a second, but usually it's without the right to vote. So you don't get all these sort of foreign people, even though they're Italians, coming into Rome, taking seats in the Senate, taking away power from the powerful patricians. That doesn't happen because of this. So they get citizenship, but they can't vote, mutual protection. And then in the early period, you get no taxes for the Italians. In other cases where you've got resistance to Roman rule, the Romans will come in, roll over anybody who's there, take the land, and then sell people off into slavery, either into Roman territories or outside of Roman territories. Now, I've got a big chunk of text here. Hopefully you've read this article by Scheidel on human mobility. where this article is really talking about free populations. What I'd like you to do, if you've read it in the past, which you should have, or if you want to read it now, what I'd like you to do is just stop the slide and read through it. I'm not really going to say too much about this, but it's really about the development of colonies. Okay, we just talked, excuse me, a little bit about this idea of citizenship and what it meant to be a citizen of Rome where you are not living in the city of Rome itself. The Latin word is civitas sine suffragio, which is really citizenship. Sine is without, and suffragio, those who know a little bit of history will see like the suffragettes, those people who are fighting for the vote, the women who are fighting for vote. So that's a Latin word, and as I say here, it really means citizenship without the vote. So you see this all throughout these new territories that are being formed in Italy, and it will continue on. So again, the idea that sits behind this is that if you give citizenship to people, they will of course become more loyal. However, if you gave them the right to vote, this would really dilute the patrician class, and they were not willing to give up their power to these people who weren't living in the area. I also want you to read through Scheidel on page 10, which talks about the settlement of veterans and discusses these citizen colonies. So just to put this in a short way, when you've got the military takeover, you've got Romans who are fighting in these wars, and then you've got all this new land that's been taken over. What the Romans ended up doing is settling these veterans in different areas. It also allowed citizens to leave and set up in different areas, which are then called colonies. And there's sort of benefits to both of these. I also want you to look again at McKendrick, Roman Colonies on page 140 and 141, which talks about the process of setting up a colony. So it's pretty important to read through that and to understand this whole process. We just talked about how veterans were settled. So these are military members. So think about what are the benefits that comes with that for these people. Of course, one would be they get land. So they get land, they get to farm, and of course land was wealth. So that's one big bonus. Benefit to the Roman state, you now have soldiers living in these areas that are not sometimes close to the Rome. So these are instant soldiers that you could call up again and again in case there are problems. Now, another thing that starts happening here, and we really haven't talked about this, are the building of roads. And I think Rome is probably one of the civilizations people think about when you think about road construction. You know, what are the benefits of roads? Well, originally they're built for military purposes. You can get an army to another area very quickly by the use of roads. Now, one side benefit, which becomes a major benefit, is that roads lead to trade, or trade follows along roads. Maybe that's a better way to phrase it. So roads have multiple benefits, and this is one of the reasons, two reasons why the Romans ended up building them, with the main one being military. We've talked about this a little in a previous lecture about some of the archaeology that's going on in the 300s. And if you remember, we talked about the 5th century crisis and how there's a lack of buildings in the late 300s. As you move down to the middle, late 300s, you get quite a few more large buildings like temples, aqueducts, and so on. Unfortunately, one of the things that is missing from the archaeological record are how the poor people actually lived. And this is the case for all of ancient history. It's really hard to tell what poor people were doing. There are some examples in Pompeii, which we'll look at in a few weeks, from the 200s BC, that give us maybe a better glimpse of what's going on, if we can assume what's going on in Pompeii is happening in other territories. So we'll just save that for a few weeks. I do want to spend quite a few of the rest of the slides on talking about how the city of Rome was growing in terms of water use. So of course you need water to live. The population is getting larger and larger. They're building these walls around the city, and with a growing population you have to feed them and they have to drink. So one thing they started to do, which is sort of amazing technological feat was to build these aqueducts. The first one was Aqua, and as you can see, it was 10 miles long, which is quite a feat in terms of technology, architecture, organization for the government, and so on. This map probably isn't the best. You may have to zoom in on this, stop the video and zoom in, but you can see where some of those sources of water are coming from, and sometimes they are not close to Rome. So they're linking into either lakes or large river systems that do not flow by the city, and then physically bringing in the water. I've made this little chart here showing you some of the volumes of these aqueducts. So if you look at, let me just draw here. If you look at the Aqua Appia, made in 312, you've got almost 3 million cubic gallons of water coming in through this particular aqueduct. If you look at the one that was built in the 270s, you've got a little over 6 million. And then later on, one of the bigger ones, you've got about 6.5 million. And these two were built very close to each other. So what you've got is this massive influx of fresh water into the city, which of course can be used for lots of different things, including agriculture. This is one of the more famous aqueducts. It's from Spain. It comes a little bit later than the time period we're talking about. But here you can see the structure where they have multiple, let me see if I can draw on here, multiple levels and these arches that are built, and then with these pillars built over the middle to carry the weight. And then the water runs along the top. This is taken from on top of an aqueduct, and as I put here, it's the channel for water, so the water is flowing here. And these were amazing feats of technology. If you think about the slope of these things are like a few inches every once in a while, and so it gets the water to flow down not too fast, because you don't want water traveling so fast that it's going to crash into where it's going. And of course, you don't want it to go too slow, because it won't really do the job that it was designed to. Now, what you're looking at here is sort of a distribution tank. So the water would come into this particular tank, and you can see these holes here. These are where the pipes were. So it comes into this particular tank, and then these pipes lead the water out to wherever it was going. They created a lot of interesting ways to control the water. So one is, I just showed you a reservoir tank. If you think about water that's coming from a lake or a river, you can get a lot of sediment in it. And so you get these things called settlement tanks, where the water is running down, say, and then you have it run into a tank. Let's see if I can draw this. And then the sediment builds up here, and then you have the water continue out through here. So all the sediment is going to drain into this tank, and then you get cleaner water coming down. Water fresheners, what they sometimes do is to aerate the water, they will build, like put stones sort of in the way, so it sort of increases the air to the water, and it makes it a little bit fresher. They use stopcocks to stop the water in certain places and turn it on with more pressure or less pressure. And they also built these siphons, so you're not always going to get an area where you can totally get a downslope from point A to point B. Sometimes it will have to go uphill, and they've created these siphons to push the water uphill. So it's quite a bit of technology to build. Now, what I've got here is a movie I'd like you to watch. And I don't think it's going to play on this particular slide, but I've given you the link here, which you probably don't want to type. But what you can do is go to YouTube and type in Rick Steves Europe, and then it's Provence, France, and then you can type the rest of this. And it gives a really good 4-minute view of some of these aqueducts. And on this last slide, if I were playing this in class, this would actually work. I doubt it's going to work on this type of recording, but this is what the video should look like.